Hey there, so today we're diving into something really fascinating, the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, these books are packed with history, but not just any history. It's about the people of Israel after a major life-changing event. Picture this, they've been through exile, they've lost their homeland, and now they're returning to rebuild their lives. But here's the thing, when they come back, they don't even remember their history. They've lost touch with who they really are. And that's where Chronicles comes in. It's like a handbook, helping them reconnect with their roots. So let's explore how these ancient genealogies and stories give us a glimpse of redemption, legacy, and some really powerful lessons along the way. Alright, so let's take a moment to really understand what 1st and 2nd Chronicles are all about. These books, part of the Old Testament, play an important role in the history of Israel, especially for the people who had just come back from exile. Now, to really get why these books are significant, we've got to know a bit about the context they were written in. Imagine this, Israel, the people of God, had been in exile in Babylon for 70 years. It's a long time, right? During that time, they were separated from their land, their temple, and for many of them, their identity. These weren't just bad years. They were years of loss, uncertainty, and major cultural and spiritual disruption. But after 70 years, things change. The Persian Empire, under King Cyrus, conquers Babylon and allows the Israelites to return to their homeland. It's a new beginning, but it comes with challenges. Most of the people returning had never seen Israel before. They were born in Babylon, didn't know the language or the traditions, and had little connection to their heritage. They were trying to piece together a fractured identity. So, what role do 1st and 2nd Chronicles play in all of this? Well, these books were written for a people who needed to reconnect with their past, with their roots, with who they really were as the children of Israel. They had to be reminded of their history, of the promises God had made to their ancestors, and, importantly, who they were as a people set apart. But here's where it gets really interesting. In the Hebrew Bible, these books aren't split into two. 1 and 2 Chronicles are just one book called Divrei Hayamim, which means the words of the days, or more simply, the annals. Now, in the Christian Old Testament, we have them as separate books, but the content is essentially one continuous narrative. The writer of Chronicles, likely Ezra, wants the Israelites to understand that they're a part of something much bigger than themselves. They're not just any people. They are the people of the covenant. The ones chosen by God to be a light to the nations. And the genealogies that we see at the beginning of Chronicles, they serve a huge purpose. Now, let's pause here for a second because genealogies can feel a little dry and hard to relate to sometimes, right? A lot of names, a lot of so-and-so begat so-and-so. But the genealogies in Chronicles are so much more than just a family tree. For the Israelites returning from exile, these genealogies were like a lifeline to their history. They were a way to remind them of their ancestors, their tribes, and their legacy. They're like an anchor in a stormy sea of confusion. You see, Israel was a nation built on relationships and promises. The promises made to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And these genealogies kept track of who belonged to which tribe, which family, and where they fit into the bigger picture of God's story. So, for those returning exiles, this wasn't just about remembering names. It was about rediscovering their identity. It was about remembering that they weren't just returning to land, they were returning to a story that began long before them and would continue long after them. The first part of Chronicles, covering 1st Chronicles, starts by going all the way back to Adam, tracing the genealogy of the Israelites through the famous patriarchs. From there, it focuses on the tribe of Judah, and specifically on David, the king who united the people and made Jerusalem the capital. Why David? Well, because he's the central figure in God's covenant with Israel. God promised David that his descendants would sit on the throne forever. That's huge. And even though the Israelites were returning to their land after a time of exile and judgment, the writer of Chronicles wants them to remember that God's promises still stand. David's line is still the line of promise, even if the people don't see the full fulfillment of it right then and there. So, Chronicles isn't just about retelling old stories. It's about reminding these people of the foundation they stand on. It's about reconnecting them with God's eternal plan for their nation. Now, let's talk about how these books fit into the larger context of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. And when we look at the Hebrew Bible, 1st and 2nd Chronicles actually come at the end of the entire collection of books, just before the book of Ezra. So, for the Jewish people, Chronicles is a book of reflection. It's the last word, the final chapter, on the nation of Israel before they step into the post-exilic world. But in the Christian Old Testament, Chronicles comes after Kings. So, while Kings ends with a sad note, Israel's exile and fall, Chronicles offers a different perspective. Instead of focusing primarily on the failure of Israel's kings, Chronicles highlights the successes, especially the reign of David and Solomon. It's like a recap of the best parts of the nation's history, like with an eye on restoring hope and identity. It's about finding restoration after a time of exile and loss. What's fascinating, though, is that even though 1st and 2nd Chronicles cover similar ground to the books of Samuel and Kings, they have a different tone. While Samuel and Kings tell the story of Israel's kings with all their ups and downs, Chronicles focuses more on the positive aspects of Israel's history. Nice, Thierry. It's like a highlight reel. The writer of Chronicles wants the people to see God's faithfulness, even in the midst of all the mess and struggle. And that's important because for the people coming back from exile, they needed hope. They needed a reminder that God hadn't forgotten them, that his promises still stood, and that they were still a part of his plan. Another key point about Chronicles is its focus on the temple, worship, and the priests. The writer of Chronicles emphasizes the importance of worshiping God properly, according to the laws and instructions given to Moses. In other words, Chronicles is about reestablishing the heart of Israel, worship. The people were coming back to a broken land, but they were also coming back to rebuild the temple, to restore worship, and to renew their covenant with God. And so, this book doesn't just tell the story of Israel's kings, it also brings the focus back to the priests and Levites, those responsible for leading the people in worship. The writer of Chronicles is saying, yes, Israel had kings, but their true king is God, and their true purpose is to worship him. That's a message that's just as relevant today as it was back then. In short, the significance of 1st and 2nd Chronicles is rooted in the idea of restoration, restoring a people's identity, their history, and their relationship with God. For the exiles returning from Babylon, Chronicles wasn't just a historical record, it was a way for them to reconnect with their past, to find hope for their future, and to see how their story fit into God's bigger plan. It's a book about reminding them who they were, who they are, and who they are becoming. And the genealogies, they're not just boring lists, they're part of that bigger story, helping the Israelites reclaim their heritage and reestablish their relationship with God. It's all about restoring what was lost, reconnecting with God's promises, and remembering that no matter how far they'd gone, God was still there, still faithful, still holding on to his promises. Alright, now let's dive into the genealogy of Judah and why it's such a big deal in 1st Chronicles. For the people returning from exile, these details were not just ancient family records, they were a reminder of who they were, where they came from, and the promises that God made to their ancestors. It was a crucial part of their identity, and understanding this genealogy gave them a sense of continuity in their broken world. Now, Judah was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, his 4th son to be exact, but while he wasn't the firstborn, Judah became incredibly significant for the story of Israel. Why? Well, because the kings of Israel would come from his line, specifically the line of King David. The writer of Chronicles takes great care to trace Judah's lineage, and we're talking about multiple generations, which might seem like a lot of names to sift through. But it's important to remember that for the returning exiles, this was more than just a list of names. This was a connection to their past, their history, and most importantly, the future. You see, the people of Israel had just spent 70 years in exile. That's a long time to be separated from your homeland, your traditions, your identity. And now, as they were coming back to Israel, many of them had never even seen the land their ancestors had lived on. They didn't speak the language fluently, they didn't understand all the customs, and most importantly, they were living in a time when it felt like God's promises were distant. So, what does the writer of Chronicles do? He reaches back into the past, pulls out the stories and genealogies, and reminds the people that their identity is rooted in something much bigger than their current circumstances. Let's start with Judah himself. You might remember that Judah wasn't exactly the shining star among his brothers, especially with the whole story of selling Joseph into slavery. But over time, Judah proves to be a man of leadership and courage, especially when it comes to his younger brother, Benjamin. Judah's transformation is part of why his descendants are singled out as the royal line. And that's where Chronicles begins, showing us how the line of Judah leads all the way down to King David. And David, as we know, is a pivotal figure in Israel's history. He's the king who unites the tribes of Israel, establishes Jerusalem as the capital, and most importantly, receives God's promise that his descendants will sit on the throne forever. So, when the writer of Chronicles begins with Judah's genealogy, he's making a point. He's saying, this is where it all starts. This is the line that leads to David, the one whom God promised would always have a descendant on the throne. For the people returning from exile, this was a huge deal. Why? Because they had no king anymore. Their land had been overrun, the temple had been destroyed, and they were now a people without a ruler. The genealogies and chronicles were meant to show them that even though they didn't have a king at that moment, God's promise to David still stood. David's line wasn't broken, it was just waiting for the right moment to continue. Now, let's take a closer look at how the genealogy unfolds in 1 Chronicles. We start with Judah's sons, Onan, and Shelah. These were the first 3 sons of Judah, but things don't go well with them. The firstborn, is actually killed by God because he was wicked in the sight of the Lord. Then Onan, his brother, is also struck down, though the details of why are a bit more complicated. So, by the time we reach Judah's 3rd son, Shelah, things are already looking a bit rough for Judah's line. But then, something important happens. Judah's daughter-in-law, Tamar, has twins, Perez and Zerah. Perez, in particular, becomes important because it's his line that leads to David. Now, it might seem like a strange story to focus on, but think about what the writer of Chronicles is doing here. He's reminding the people that even in moments of scandal and difficulty, God's purposes move forward. Judah's family line wasn't perfect, far from it, but God still chose to work through it. And that's a big theme in the Bible, isn't it? God doesn't choose perfect people. He chooses imperfect people and works through them to accomplish his purposes. For the exiles returning to the land, this was a reminder, even though they were imperfect and broken, God could still use them for his plan. So, after Perez, we move to his son, Hezron, and then to Hezron's sons, who include Ram. And this is where the genealogy starts to connect more directly to David. Ram, one of the descendants of Judah, becomes the father of Aminadab, and from there, we continue the line all the way to David. This is where it gets really important for the people of Israel, from Ram to Aminadab, to Nahshon, to Salmon, to Boaz, and finally, we get to Jesse, the father of David. The genealogy is pointing directly to David's line, emphasizing that he's the rightful king, and that this promise of a king from Judah's line is still in play. But let's pause for a moment and think about what this meant for the people hearing this story. They had been exiled for 70 years, and during that time, they had no king. They had been ruled by foreign powers. And now, as they return to the land, they're struggling to figure out what the future holds. The writer of Chronicles could have easily skipped over the details of these genealogies, but instead, he's taking the time to remind the people that God's promises haven't been forgotten. The line of David is still there, waiting for the right time to rise again. The genealogy also reminds the returning exiles of their roots. By connecting them to Judah, and then specifically to David, it's like the writer is saying, this is who you are. You're the people of David. You're the people who were chosen by God, and you still have a future in his plan. And in a time when the Israelites might have felt like they were just a small, insignificant group of people, these genealogies were a powerful reminder that they were part of something much larger, something eternal. It's worth noting that the focus on Judah's genealogy isn't just about tracing the kings of Israel. It's about the broader story of Israel's relationship with God. The genealogy starts with Judah, but it's not just about his descendants ruling Israel. It's about the larger picture of how God works through flawed people to bring about about his will. For the people coming back from exile, this was a profound message. They were returning to a broken land, to a city that had been destroyed, and they had to rebuild everything from the ground up. But the message of the genealogy was clear. God had been with their ancestors, and he was still with them. The promises to David were still valid, and they were still part of that promise. And then, of course, we come to the most significant figure in this genealogy, David himself. The writer of Chronicles doesn't just mention David briefly, he emphasizes his importance. David is the one who established the kingdom of Israel, the one who united the tribes, and the one who brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. But David's importance isn't just about what he did during his lifetime, it's about the promise God made to him. God promised David that his descendants would sit on the throne forever, and even though the Israelites were in exile and their kingdom was in ruins, this promise still held true. The writer of Chronicles wanted the returning exiles to understand that they were part of that promise. They were the descendants of Judah, the tribe that would bring forth the king who would one day rule over Israel and through whom God's eternal kingdom would come. So, in a sense, this genealogy isn't just a list of names, it's a declaration of hope. For the exiles returning to Israel, it's a reminder that God hadn't forgotten his promises. Even though they were living in a time of hardship and uncertainty, God was still at work. And just as the genealogy traces the line of Judah all the way to David, it's also pointing forward to a future king, one who would fulfill all the promises made to David, and through whom all nations would be blessed. The significance of Judah's genealogy is not just that it traces the past, it's that it points to the future. And for the exiles, that was exactly the kind of hope they needed as they returned to rebuild their land and their lives. In the end, this genealogy of Judah, leading all the way to King David, is a story of continuity. It's a story that reminds the people that even though things look difficult right now, they're part of a much larger ongoing story of God's faithfulness. The line of Judah, the line of David, continues on, and even in the midst of exile and brokenness, God is still at work. And for the returning exiles, that was the greatest hope they could have, knowing that God's promises are never broken, even when things seem uncertain. The line of Judah, leading to David, was a sign that God's plan was still in motion, and that their story was part of something much bigger than they could imagine. Okay, now let's talk about something a little more complicated, the family dynamics within David's household. Now, David, as we know, is one of the most significant figures in Israel's history. He's the king who united the tribes, established Jerusalem as the capital, and received God's promise that his descendants would rule Israel forever. But if you take a look at his personal life, it was far from perfect. In fact, David's family story is full of drama, dysfunction, and heartache. While David was a great leader, his role as a father and a husband was, well, a bit of a mess. David had multiple wives, and that right there set the stage for a lot of complicated family relationships. The Bible doesn't give us a lot of detail about how David managed his many marriages, but we can imagine that it caused a fair amount of tension and conflict. So, when we start talking about David's children, we're not just looking at a handful of kids from one wife. We're looking at the offspring of different women, each with their own personalities, struggles, and stories. And this is where the real challenges begin. David's firstborn son was Amnon. Now, Amnon's story is one of the darkest and most tragic in the Bible. He was born to David's first wife, Ahinoam. Amnon had a half-sister named Tamar, and he became infatuated with her. But this wasn't a typical sibling relationship. Amnon's obsession with Tamar led to him raping her. Now, this is a shocking and painful moment in the story. But what's even more disturbing is the aftermath. Instead of taking responsibility for his actions, Amnon's behavior sets off a chain of events that will tear David's family apart. Tamar's full brother, Absalom, was furious about what happened to her. And this is where the dysfunction really starts to snowball. Absalom, a son born to David by his wife Maacah, is a key figure in the story. He was deeply affected by the injustice done to his sister. Amnon's crime against Tamar was a terrible violation, and Absalom couldn't let it go. Instead of going to his father, David, and seeking justice, Absalom took matters into his own hands. He waited 2 years before plotting revenge. He had Amnon killed, and while this may have felt like justice to Absalom, it created even more chaos within David's house. David, as a father, was heartbroken by the loss of his son Amnon, and he was torn between his grief and his sense of justice. But he didn't act decisively, and as a result, the tension between him and Absalom continued to grow. Absalom's anger wasn't just about revenge for his sister, it also reflected deeper issues in David's family. David, as the king, was consumed with ruling the nation and didn't always give his children the attention they needed. He didn't intervene when Amnon attacked Tamar, and his lack of action led to Absalom feeling ignored and overlooked. As time passed, Absalom's bitterness grew, and he began to plot against his father. Eventually, Absalom rebelled and tried to take David's throne. He led a rebellion, gathering followers and creating a civil war within Israel. At one point, it seemed like David might lose everything: his kingdom, his throne, and even his life now. As if that wasn't enough drama for one family, there's even more going on behind the scenes. David had other sons as well, and many of them played important roles in the story of Israel. One of these sons was Solomon, the son born to David and Bathsheba. Solomon is, of course, famous for his wisdom and for building the temple in Jerusalem, but his story also reflects some of the complex relationships within David's family. Solomon was the product of David's affair with Bathsheba, which had started in a very scandalous way. David, after committing adultery with Bathsheba, had her husband, Uriah, killed in battle. It's one of the darkest chapters in David's life, and yet out of this broken situation, Solomon was born. Despite the circumstances of his birth, Solomon would go on to become the king who would succeed David. Solomon's rise to the throne, though, wasn't without its own challenges. After David's death, there was a power struggle over who would rule Israel. David had other sons, and some of them wanted to be king. Adonijah, for example, was David's fourth son, and at one point he tried to seize the throne for himself. Adonijah's attempt to take over was thwarted by Solomon. With the help of Bathsheba and Nathan the prophet, Solomon eventually secured the throne, but the fact that David's own sons were fighting for control of the kingdom shows just how fractured and dysfunctional his family was. Now, as we look at the broader picture of David's family, it's important to remember that the dysfunction wasn't just about individual actions, it was about the patterns that were set in motion over time. David's failure to discipline his children, to provide proper guidance, and to address issues when they first arose had lasting consequences. His inability to deal with Amnon's sin, his lack of action when Absalom rebelled, and the tension between his sons all point to a larger issue within David's household, a lack of strong leadership and clear boundaries. But it wasn't just about David's parenting, or lack thereof. David's own personal flaws played a role in his family's dysfunction. His affair with Bathsheba, his failure to confront his own sin, and his tendency to let things slide in his household created an environment where bad decisions festered. His family was marked by jealousy, deceit, betrayal, and violence. And in many ways, these issues were reflections of David's own failures as a man. David, despite his incredible success as a king, was a deeply flawed individual. He had a heart after God, yes, but he was also prone to making terrible mistakes. Despite all the dysfunction, though, we can't overlook one important aspect of David's family story: redemption. Even in the midst of all the chaos, God was still at work. God had made a covenant with David that his descendants would sit on the throne forever. And even though David's family was a mess, that promise didn't go away. It's fascinating to see how, through all the strife and heartbreak, David's family line continued. Even though Absalom's rebellion almost brought down the kingdom, David's throne was eventually restored, and his line would continue on through Solomon. And from there, we know that eventually, the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to David came with the birth of Jesus, who was a descendant of David. So, when we look at the dysfunction in David's family, we can't ignore the fact that it's part of a larger story, a story of God's grace and faithfulness. Despite the messiness of human life, the dysfunction in David's family doesn't disqualify them from being used by God. In fact, it highlights God's ability to work through imperfect people. David's family, for all its drama and heartbreak, is still part of God's redemptive plan. As we reflect on David's family, we're reminded of the complexity of human relationships. Families aren't perfect, and even the best people make mistakes. David was a man after God's own heart, yet his family life was full of pain, betrayal, and brokenness. And if we're honest, we can all relate to that in some way. We all have family struggles, whether they're big or small, and sometimes it feels like things will never be fixed. But the story of David's family shows us that even in the midst of dysfunction, God is still at work. He doesn't abandon us because of our mistakes. He's willing to work through our messes to bring about his purpose. And that, ultimately, is the hope we can cling to when we face our own family struggles. In the end, the story of David's sons is a story of brokenness, redemption, and God's unshakable faithfulness. Despite the dysfunction, the fighting, and the pain, David's family continued to play a crucial role in God's plan for Israel. And even though David's household was filled with drama, it was also filled with the possibility of redemption. So, as we look at David's family tree, we don't just see a list of names or a collection of scandals. We see a story of God's grace at work in the midst of human failure. As we look deeper into the genealogies in 1 Chronicles, it's easy to see them as just long lists of names, a dry recounting of lineage that seems a little disconnected from our modern lives. But in reality, these genealogies are much more than a historical record. They offer timeless lessons about legacy, identity, and the importance of living a life that seeks God's favor. One story that stands out amidst the genealogies is that of Jabez, and his story has profound lessons for us today. Jabez is introduced in a very understated way in 1 Chronicles 4:9-10. The writer gives just a few lines to a man who could easily have been lost in the shuffle of names, but instead, his brief moment in the spotlight is a powerful example of how one person can make a significant impact by doing one simple thing: praying. It says in verse 9 that Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. Right away, we see that Jabez wasn't just another name in the list. He stood out. He lived a life that was different. What made him different? Well, the next part of the verse tells us that his mother called his name Jabez, saying, "Because I bore him in pain." Now, imagine carrying a name like that. That Jabez's name, which means pain, was a reminder of the sorrow his mother experienced when she gave birth to him. In those days, names were often tied to circumstances, and the fact that his mother named him Pain might have meant that she saw him as a burden or a reminder of the difficulty she endured. It's hard to shake that kind of label, right? But despite this, Jabez's life becomes an example of how someone can rise above the labels or circumstances they're born into. The real turning point in Jabez's story is the prayer he prays in verse 10. In his prayer, he calls on God and asks for 4 key things: blessing, expansion, God's hand to be with him, and protection from evil. These aren't just requests for things, they're reflections of the kind of life Jabez wanted to lead. Oh, that you would bless me indeed and enlarge my territory, that your hand would be with me and that you would keep me from evil, that I may not cause pain. This simple yet profound prayer is a declaration of his desire for God's favor on his life. But more than that, it's a declaration of his desire for a legacy that would be different from the one his name might suggest. What's so powerful about Jabez's prayer is that it reflects a deep awareness of both his current reality and his future potential. He doesn't let the painful circumstances of his birth define him. Instead, he reaches out to God for help, asking him for favor and an expansion of his influence. The word enlarge in his prayer shows that Jabez isn't asking for just enough. He's asking for abundance. He's seeking a life that makes a difference. Not just for himself, but for others. He doesn't want his life to be defined by pain. He wants to leave a legacy of blessing, of expansion, and of godliness. Jabez's prayer teaches us several important lessons. First, it reminds us that prayer has the power to shape our legacy. Jabez didn't sit back and accept the limitations of his circumstances. He didn't let the label of pain define his future. Instead, he chose to engage with God in a meaningful way, asking for what he needed to fulfill his calling and his potential. That's the first thing we can learn from him. Don't let where you come from or the circumstances around you limit what you ask God for. We all have a part of our story that feels difficult or even painful, but that doesn't mean our story is over. prayer, when we approach it with faith, can turn our circumstances around and give us the chance to live out a different narrative, a narrative of hope and purpose. The second lesson from Jabez's prayer is the importance of seeking God's blessing. It's easy to feel like we're supposed to figure things out on our own, to rely on our own strength. But Jabez shows us that there is nothing wrong with asking God to bless us, and not just in a small way, but in a big way. His prayer asks for blessing indeed, a way of saying, God, I want your favor on my life in every way possible. There's nothing selfish about this request. It's a recognition that we need God's hand on our lives if we are to make any lasting impact. It's an acknowledgement that without God's blessing, we are limited in what we can achieve. But with His blessing, everything changes. This isn't about asking for material wealth or comfort, but about asking God to enable us to live in alignment with His will. We might think of Jabez's prayer as a request for a broader influence or for opportunities to do good in the world. The word territory in his prayer can symbolize more than land. It can represent influence, opportunities, or areas where we can have a positive impact. Jabez doesn't just want to survive, he wants to thrive, and he wants God's hand to be with him every step of the way. Another crucial element of Jabez's prayer is the request for God's protection from evil. The part of his prayer that asks, "That you would keep me from evil, that I may not cause pain," is deeply insightful. Jabez knows that with blessing and expansion comes the responsibility to handle it wisely. He is asking for protection from the destructive forces that could pull him off course. He's asking God not just to bless him, but to help him be a blessing. This part of his prayer speaks to the idea that we can ask God not only for favor, but also for wisdom in using that favor. And as we reflect on Jabez's life, it's a call to consider our own legacy. What kind of legacy do we want to leave? What are we praying for in our own lives? Are we asking for God's blessing, for an expansion of our influence, and for protection from the things that could cause harm? Jabez's prayer calls us to think about what we're asking God for, not just in terms of personal success or comfort, but in terms of our calling to live a life that blesses others. And let's not miss the significance of God's response to Jabez's prayer. The verse ends with this simple statement, "So God granted him what he requested." Isn't that incredible? God heard Jabez's prayer, and he answered it. It wasn't just wishful thinking. It was a real request that God honored. The fact that Jabez's prayer was answered tells us something important. God wants to bless us. He wants to see us succeed in the things that matter. When we ask him with a pure heart, with a desire to glorify him and to bless others, God delights in answering those prayers. As we think about legacy, we should also consider the role of prayer in shaping that legacy. Prayer is more than just asking for things. It's about aligning our hearts with God's will, seeking his guidance, and trusting that he will lead us in the right direction. It's through prayer that we can grow closer to God, understand his purpose for our lives, and receive the strength to carry out that purpose. Jabez's legacy wasn't just about the things he asked for, it was about the heart behind the request. He wanted God's favor, not just for personal gain, but so that his life would be marked by blessing and protection, and so that he could be a blessing to others. When we look at our own journey, we should ask ourselves, what kind of legacy am I building? Am I asking God for the things that will help me fulfill his purpose in my life? Am I seeking his favor, not for selfish reasons, but so that I can be a blessing to others? Just as Jabez's prayer changed his future, our prayers can change ours. We have the opportunity to ask God for favor, for protection, and for a life that reflects his goodness. And like Jabez, when we ask in faith, we can trust that God will grant us what we request, according to his will and in his timing. Ultimately, Jabez's story is a reminder that regardless of where we come from, we have the power to shape our own legacy through prayer. We can break free from the circumstances of our past, seek God's blessing, and live a life that leaves a positive, lasting impact on the world around us. Just as God granted Jabez's request, he is faithful to bless those who seek him with an open heart. So let this be an encouragement to us all. Don't underestimate the power of prayer. Don't settle for a life that simply survives. Ask God to bless you indeed, to expand your territory, and to keep you from evil so that you can be a blessing to those around you and leave a legacy that honors him. As we continue through the genealogies in 1 Chronicles, we encounter two figures whose actions and decisions carry lessons that echo through history, Simeon and Reuben. While their stories may seem distant, the consequences they faced and the mistakes they made offer us valuable reflections on justice, anger, and sexual sin, topics that are still relevant to us today. These lessons aren't just for ancient times, they speak directly to the choices we make in our own lives and the legacy we leave behind. Let's start with Simeon. Simeon, as you may remember, was the second son of Jacob, and his life is marked by a pivotal and tragic event early on. In Genesis 34, Simeon, alongside his brother Levi, took revenge on the men of the city of Shechem after their sister Dinah was raped. Instead of seeking justice in a righteous and measured way, Simeon and Levi resorted to violence, slaughtering all the men of the city. This was a serious overreaction, and it had lasting consequences for Simeon and his descendants. When Jacob later reflects on this event, he condemns their actions, pointing out that their recklessness could bring harm to their family. Jacob's words in Genesis 49:5-7 are a clear warning. Simeon and Levi's anger led to actions that could destroy their entire family. Jacob says, "Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel." This is a profound reminder that unchecked anger can lead to destruction. Simeon, instead of taking a measured approach, allowed his rage to dictate his actions, and it caused harm not only to others but to his own family. What Simeon's story teaches us is that while anger is a natural emotion, when it's left unchecked, it can lead to serious consequences. We may not always see the immediate fallout from our anger, but just like Simeon's reckless revenge, it can destroy relationships and bring long-lasting consequences. So, what can we learn from Simeon? First, it's a lesson about justice. Simeon was right to want justice for his sister Dinah, but his actions didn't reflect the kind of justice that God desires. True justice doesn't come from retaliation or violence. It comes from doing what is right in God's eyes, seeking his guidance, and acting in a way that reflects his character. Simeon's actions were driven by vengeance rather than a righteous desire to see things set right, and as a result, the entire family paid a price. This teaches us that when we seek justice, we must be careful to do so in a way that honors God and aligns with his values, not our own impulses or emotions. Now, let's turn to Reuben, the firstborn son of Jacob. Reuben's story is one that deals with the consequences of sexual sin and the loss of a birthright. In Genesis 35, we learn that Reuben, in a moment of weakness and poor judgment, slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah. This act was not only an offense against his father, but also a betrayal of trust within the family. In ancient cultures, the firstborn son held significant privileges, especially in terms of inheritance, but Reuben's actions forfeited these rights. When Jacob, now nearing the end of his life, pronounces blessings over his sons in Genesis 49, he mentions Reuben's sin and says, "Unstable as water, you shall not excel, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it." Reuben's story is a powerful reminder of the consequences of sexual sin. His actions were more than just a mistake. They were a breach of trust and a violation of God's design for relationships. Reuben's sin cost him his birthright, and he would not be the one to inherit the leadership of the family. Instead, his birthright was passed on to Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. The lesson here is clear. Sexual sin doesn't just have personal consequences, it affects our legacy and the people around us. Reuben's loss of the birthright is a stark reminder that the choices we make, especially in moments of weakness, can have far-reaching consequences. When we reflect on Reuben's story, we see that it's not just about one sin, it's about how that sin impacted his whole future. As the firstborn, he had a unique opportunity to lead the family and inherit a double portion of the blessings. But his moment of temptation led to a long-lasting consequence that he couldn't undo. His story teaches us about the importance of guarding our hearts and making wise decisions, especially in the areas of sexuality and relationships. In today's world, we're often bombarded with messages that trivialize sexual sin, but the story of Reuben shows us how destructive it can be. It doesn't just affect our immediate relationships, it can impact the course of our lives and the legacies we leave behind. Now, let's connect these stories to our own lives. Both Simeon and Reuben faced consequences because of their actions, and their stories remind us of how important it is to make wise choices, particularly in areas like anger and sexual integrity. It's easy to think that our decisions don't matter or that we can get away with things, but the stories of Simeon and Reuben show us that even seemingly small actions can have a huge impact. In the case of Simeon, we see how unchecked anger led to a breakdown in relationships and ultimately cost him favor with his father. Anger, when not dealt with appropriately, can destroy trust and cause division. How often do we find ourselves acting impulsively out of anger, only to regret it later? Maybe it's an argument with a loved one, a reaction to a perceived wrong, or a decision made in haste. Simeon's story is a reminder that, while anger is a natural emotion, we need to take responsibility for it and seek God's wisdom before we act. We need to remember that our anger doesn't justify our actions. It's how we respond to our anger that matters. As the Bible tells us in Ephesians 4:26, "In your anger, do not sin." We can feel angry, but we must choose to respond in a way that honors God and protects our relationships. As for Reuben, his story is a sobering reminder of the consequences of sexual sin. It's easy to think of sexual sin as something that doesn't have lasting effects, especially in a world where many people view it as no big deal. But Reuben's actions show us that sexual sin has consequences that go beyond just the moment. It affects our relationships, our integrity, and our future. Reuben's decision to sleep with Bilhah didn't just affect him, it affected his entire family, and it cost him his birthright. In the same way, our decisions in this area affect more than just ourselves. They affect those we love, and they affect our legacy. So, what can we learn from the stories of Simeon and Reuben? First, we need to recognize the power of our actions. Our choices, whether driven by anger or temptation, don't just affect the present, they shape our future. Simeon's revenge led to broken relationships, and Reuben's sin cost him his inheritance. Both of these men made decisions that affected not only their lives, but the lives of those around them. Second, we need to understand the importance of repentance and seeking God's forgiveness. While Simeon and Reuben's actions had long-lasting consequences, we know that God offers grace and forgiveness to those who seek it. Even when we fail, God can restore us if we humble ourselves and turn back to Him. Finally, these stories remind us to consider the legacy we're building. What kind of legacy do we want to leave? Are we making decisions that reflect God's values and will leave a positive impact on those around us? Are we living in a way that honors God and sets a good example for the next generation? Simeon and Reuben's stories are cautionary tales, but they also serve as reminders that the decisions we make today shape the lives of those who come after us. Our choices matter, and they can either build or destroy the legacy we leave behind. As we reflect on the stories of Simeon and Reuben, let's take time to examine our own hearts and actions. Are there areas where we need to seek God's forgiveness? Are there patterns in our lives that need to change? Just as Simeon and Reuben had the opportunity to choose differently, so do we. And with God's help, we can make choices that honor Him and leave a legacy of righteousness and love for those who follow us. As we continue through the pages of Chronicles, we come to a story about 3 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, that offers some powerful lessons on the importance of staying close to God and the dangers of distance, both physically and spiritually. The story of these tribes unfolds in 1 Chronicles 5, and it's a sobering reminder of how making decisions based on comfort and convenience can lead to spiritual decline. Let's dive into the situation these tribes faced and what we can learn from their choices. Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh were among the 12 tribes of Israel, and each of them had received a portion of land in the Promised Land. However, when the Israelites arrived at the Jordan River and were ready to cross over into the land that God had promised them, 2.5 tribes made a request. Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh approached Moses with a proposal. They didn't want to cross the Jordan River with the rest of the Israelites into the land that God had promised. Instead, they asked for land on the east side of the Jordan River, where there was fertile pasture land for their flocks. It seemed like a reasonable request at the time. The land was good, and the tribes had many animals that needed grazing space. Moses, at first, was hesitant. He understood that this decision could have long-term consequences, and he wasn't sure that allowing these tribes to settle on the east side of the river was the right move. Moses' initial reaction was to question their loyalty and commitment to the rest of the community. "Why do you want to stay behind while the rest of the Israelites cross into the land?" he asked them. His concern was that their decision to settle apart from the rest of the tribes might weaken the unity of Israel. It was a valid concern. These tribes would be geographically separated from the other tribes, and this could lead to spiritual isolation. After some negotiation, these tribes agreed to fight alongside the rest of Israel to conquer the land. They promised to help their brothers take possession of the promised land before returning to their land east of the Jordan River. But even with that agreement, the separation still created a vulnerability. Eventually, the physical distance between these tribes and the rest of Israel led to spiritual consequences. Over time, they began to drift away from the faith and the central worship in Jerusalem. They became increasingly influenced by the pagan nations around them, and they abandoned the worship of the one true God. Their separation from the other tribes, both physically and spiritually, opened the door for idolatry and disobedience to creep in. This story holds important lessons for us today, especially in a world where it's easy to feel disconnected from the broader community of believers. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh made a decision based on convenience and comfort, but that decision ultimately had spiritual consequences. They thought they could live separately and still remain faithful to God, but the reality was that their distance from the rest of the Israelites made it easier for them to fall into sin. Their story is a reminder that isolation, even if it seems harmless at first, can lead to spiritual decline. It's a principle that we can all apply to our lives. In our fast-paced, individualistic culture, it's tempting to think we can go it alone or that we don't need others to maintain our faith. But the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh show us that distance from the community of believers can weaken our spiritual resolve. Just like they were susceptible to the influence of the pagan nations around them, we too can be influenced by the world when we choose to separate ourselves from the body of Christ. The New Testament emphasizes the importance of fellowship and community in the life of a believer. Hebrews 10:25 encourages us, "Let us not neglect meeting together, as some have made a habit, but let us encourage one another." Being part of a church community is more than just a social activity. It's a vital part of our spiritual health. Just like the tribes of Israel were stronger when they were united, we too are stronger when we walk together in faith. There's power in community, in sharing our struggles, in praying for one another, and in holding each other accountable. The early church understood this well. In Acts 2:42, we see the early believers devoted to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Fellowship was central to their lives. It was how they grew spiritually, how they found support, and how they were able to live out their faith in a challenging world. In contrast, when we distance ourselves from the fellowship of believers, we make ourselves vulnerable. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh were initially able to maintain their commitment to the rest of Israel, but over time, the physical distance between them and the rest of the tribes created a spiritual distance as well. They no longer participated in the central worship in Jerusalem, and their lives became more influenced by the surrounding pagan cultures. This shows us that when we choose to separate ourselves, we risk becoming more susceptible to the influences of the world around us. The spiritual consequences for these tribes were severe. By the time we get to the later chapters of 1 Chronicles, we see that these tribes were eventually taken into captivity by the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and these tribes, who had once been part of the unified nation, were scattered. The spiritual isolation they had created for themselves played a role in their downfall. Their decision to live apart from the other tribes weakened their faith and ultimately led to their destruction. This history should serve as a cautionary tale for us. It's not just about physical separation, it's about the spiritual risks we face when we choose to isolate ourselves. It's easy to think that we can worship God on our own, away from the community, but the Bible consistently teaches that we are meant to be part of a larger body. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul describes the church as the body of Christ, with each of us playing a unique role. He writes, "Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it." We are not meant to live our faith in isolation. We are meant to be interconnected, to encourage one another, and to hold each other up in times of struggle. When we stay connected to the body of Christ, we are better equipped to stand firm in our faith. We are strengthened by the prayers and encouragement of others, and we have the opportunity to pour into others as well. The Christian life is not meant to be lived alone. We are called to live in community, and that community helps to keep us accountable, strengthens our faith, and helps us grow in Christ's likeness. In light of the story of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, it's important for us to consider our own lives and the ways in which we may be separating ourselves from the community of believers. Are we distancing ourselves from the body of Christ? Are we neglecting the fellowship and support of our brothers and sisters in Christ? It's easy to let busyness, hurt, or a sense of independence keep us from engaging in community. But the lesson from these tribes is clear. When we separate ourselves, we risk our spiritual well-being. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh offer us a powerful reminder of the importance of staying close to God and to one another. Their physical separation led to spiritual decline, and the same can happen to us if we isolate ourselves from the body of Christ. We are stronger together, and in a world that often encourages isolation, it's more important than ever to be intentional about staying connected to the community of believers. Let us learn from their story and choose to walk in fellowship, seeking God together and encouraging one another in our journey of faith. As we come to the end of our exploration through the genealogies and the stories of Israel's tribes, we're reminded that these histories are not just about the past, they're filled with lessons about God's grace, redemption, and the power to transform even the most broken legacies. One of the most striking examples of this transformation is found in the story of Korah and his descendants. Korah, as many of you might know, was a man who rebelled against Moses and Aaron. He was a Levite, part of the tribe that was set apart for service to God. But instead of embracing his calling, Korah led a rebellion. In Numbers 16, Korah, along with 250 other influential leaders, challenged Moses' authority and questioned God's decision to set him and Aaron as the leaders of Israel. Korah and his followers were not content with the role God had assigned them. They wanted more. They believed that the priesthood should be open to everyone, and they tried to usurp Moses and Aaron's positions. But their rebellion didn't end well. God responded to their defiance in a dramatic and terrifying way. The ground opened up and swallowed Korah, his followers, and their families alive. It was a tragic end to a tragic story, and for Korah's descendants, it seemed like their legacy was forever marked by rebellion, disobedience, and destruction. But here's where God's grace steps in, and where the story takes a remarkable turn. While Korah himself and those who joined him in rebellion faced the consequences of their sin, his descendants didn't follow the same path. In fact, we learn later in the Bible, particularly in 1 Chronicles, that some of Korah's descendants would go on to become faithful servants of God. They didn't let their ancestors' rebellion define them. Instead, they embraced God's calling on their lives and became instrumental in leading worship in the temple. The descendants of Korah, as we see in 1 Chronicles 6:31-38, were given the role of musicians and singers in the service of the Lord. These were the very same people who, through the generations, became known as the Korahites, a group dedicated to praising God. They were not just content with living in the shadow of their ancestors' failure, they turned that failure into a legacy of service and worship. God, in his mercy, allowed them to redeem the family name, and their story is one of the most beautiful examples of how God can transform a legacy of rebellion into a legacy of service. This shift is a powerful reminder of the theme of redemption that runs throughout the Bible. No matter how far someone has fallen or how broken their past may seem, God is always ready to offer a new beginning. The Korahites could have chosen to carry the shame of their ancestors' rebellion, but instead, they chose to live differently. They chose to embrace God's grace, to serve him, and to lead the people of Israel in worship. Their transformation is a testament to the power of God's forgiveness and the way he can take what was once broken and turn it into something beautiful. This theme of redemption isn't just a distant historical fact, it's a message for us today. Like the Korahites, many of us have families with histories that are marked by failure, sin, or brokenness. Some of us may come from backgrounds where addiction, anger, or rebellion was a part of the story. Others may carry the weight of past mistakes or regrets that still haunt us. But the story of Korah's descendants reminds us that our past doesn't have to define our future. God can take even the most broken legacies and transform them into something beautiful. He can redeem families, heal relationships, and restore what has been lost. And this redemption is not just for individuals, it's for families. Just as Korah's descendants chose to break from the cycle of rebellion and embrace God's calling, we too can choose a different path for our families. We can decide that the mistakes of our past will not define us, but that God's grace will shape the legacy we leave behind. This is a powerful truth to hold on to, especially when we feel like our families have been marked by dysfunction, pain, or failure. God is in the business of redemption, and He doesn't give up on any family. As we reflect on the story of Korah's descendants, it's important to think about our own lives and legacies. What kind of legacy are we building? What decisions are we making today that will impact our children and grandchildren? Are we allowing God to redeem the broken parts of our story? Or are we letting those broken parts define us? The Korahites show us that it's never too late for a new beginning. Even when we inherit a legacy of sin, failure, or rebellion, God can transform it into something that brings Him glory. This is not to say that there won't be challenges. The descendants of Korah didn't just immediately step into their role as worship leaders. They had to embrace God's grace, live in obedience to His will, and honor Him with their lives. But the key point here is that they were willing to allow God to work through them, and in doing so, they became an integral part of the worship life of Israel. For us, the call is similar. We have the opportunity to break free from the negative patterns of our past and create a new legacy rooted in God's grace. This doesn't mean that we ignore the mistakes or failures of our past. It means that we acknowledge them, seek God's forgiveness, and allow Him to use us for His purposes. It means that we invite God into our families and into our lives, trusting that He can bring healing and restoration where it's needed most. As we think about our own journey, it's important to remember that no family is beyond God's reach. Whether you come from a long line of faith or a long line of dysfunction, God can bring redemption to your family story. The story of Korah's descendants is a powerful reminder that God's grace is greater than our past mistakes. He can redeem our legacy and use us to bring glory to His name. So, take a moment to reflect on what legacy you are building. Are you walking in faith, seeking God's will, and trusting Him to redeem your story? Because just as Korah's descendants were able to leave behind a legacy of worship and service, so can we. With God's grace, we too can create a legacy that points others to Him. And in doing so, honor Him in everything we do. In closing, let the story of Korah's descendants be an encouragement to all of us. Whatever your past may look like, God has the power to transform it. No matter the mistakes you or your family may have made, God can redeem your legacy and use you for His purposes. So, embrace His grace, seek His forgiveness, and step into the future He has for you. Just as Korah's descendants went from rebellion to redemption, so can we, as individuals and families, experience the transforming power of God's grace in our lives. As we wrap up our journey through the stories of the families in Chronicles, it's clear that these ancient accounts hold more than just historical facts. They offer timeless lessons that speak to us today, from the importance of legacy, to the power of prayer, to the lessons learned from mistakes and redemption. These families remind us of the impact our choices can have, not just on our own lives, but on the lives of those who come after us. Whether it's through the struggles of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, or the redemptive transformation of Korah's descendants, we see that no matter where we come from, we all have the opportunity to embrace God's grace and shape our legacies for the better. So as you reflect on these stories, take a moment to think about your own journey. What kind of legacy are you building? How can you seek God's blessing and favor in your life? And remember, no matter the mistakes or challenges you faced, God's grace is always available to restore and transform. If you found these insights helpful, be sure to subscribe for more thoughtful reflections. Thanks so much for joining today. I hope these lessons resonate with you as much as they've resonated with me. And if you've enjoyed this, a like or a share would be greatly appreciated. I'll see you next time. And remember, the journey of growth and grace is never a solo one. We're in this together.